This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I'm actually recording this episode just a little before the 2021 ASA conference, which I'm thoroughly looking forward to. And by the time you listen to this, I suspect that material from the conference will be accessible on the ASA website. So whether you made it to the conference or not, I do hope you'll take a look and consider joining the society. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. Keen-eared listeners will have noticed that the recent batch of episodes recorded by Siobhan included an interview with Rowena Lennox about her book Dingo Bold, which was published as part of the Animal Publics series. And I'm excited to say that we will have further interviews about books in this series in the future, so watch this space. Though it's a complicated story, I met today's guest after presenting at a panel called Bringing Animal Ethics and Rights into International Relations, which was at the European International Studies Association Pan-European Conference. Both today's guest and I are very keen to see animal ethics and animal studies brought into conversation with international relations, and no doubt we'll talk a little further about that later. But let me introduce you to him. Dr. Matthew Leib is a scholar of international relations, a poet, and a senior instructor in politics at Western Governors University in the United States. Much of his recent work has been about new ways of writing in international relations, looking at how, for example, poetry, text fragments, sounds, and images can help us explore interspecies relations. Today we're going to talk about his book Cosmopolitan Belongingness and War: Animals, Loss and Spectral Poetic Moments. This was published by SUNY University Press, that's SUNY University Press, in 2021. Welcome to the podcast, Matthew.
Great, thank you so much for having me, Josh.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to work on this subject?
Sure. My interest in this book has origins in my earlier work on the killing of civilians in war. So I've published on those topics such as Iraqi civilian casualties, public opinion on Palestinian and Israeli casualties. And these projects were connected to my interest in how we think about and respond to the loss of life during conflict. So as I was doing this work, I had been reading news stories about animals in the Iraq War. And these stories were striking to me as someone who has an academic interest in war and also a personal commitment to non-human animal justice. So I began writing a paper about non-human justice and the killing of stray dogs during the Iraq War, and this paper was published in 2018. And I'd also been writing little poems about these stray dogs in the margins of the academic paper. These poems were imaginative memories of stray dogs, and I wrote these poems to help orient myself to stray dog experiences. But then I didn't do anything with these poems. They were simply marginalia outside of the text. And I had also compiled little notes about the science of dogs while I was writing this academic article. And after publishing the article, I started to rethink the importance of these poems and these scientific notes. I began to think that these poems were perhaps significant, and together with the scientific fragments, they did a greater justice to the memory of non-human life lost in the Iraq War. So I began to think about how to incorporate poetry and these fragments about the science of non-human life into a book project about animals in the Iraq War. And so when I was writing the book, I began weaving poetry into the very structure of the book. And in the book structure, I wanted non-human animals to appear as a poetic or elegiac disruption in our thinking about war. And the tradition of the elegy, for those that don't know, is a tradition of poetically mourning the dead, of poetically speaking to and with the dead. So in the book, I thought it could be interesting to speak and listen to these non-human animals poetically to invite them to weigh in on how we think about and understand the experience of war. And these elegies were often arranged next to scientific fragments. So, for example, in this chapter about Isis in the book, I wrote poems about sheep, as well as like the science of neural mechanisms for facial recognition memory among sheep in the context of the killing of sheep in northern Iraq. And so this mode of textuality, interlacing theory, science, and poetry, merging the scientific and the poetic, became an attempt to engage with the mostly unknown moments of multi-species living and dying in war. So all that's to say, my interest in wartime casualties, poetry, non-human animals converged into this book project being what it is.
I see. You finished there by talking about these moments, and you use this wonderful phrase of spectral poetic moments, and you talk about encountering or creating elegiac space. Could you explain what you mean by those phrases?
When I was thinking about writing about the Iraq War, I didn't want to write about the sort of overall large events. I wanted to sort of zoom in on these imagined moments of non-human experiences of war. What were these moments, for example, that stray dogs experienced living on the streets in Baghdad when there were like dog eradication programs? When dogs were being rounded up on American bases in Iraq, what was that experience like? So rather than thinking or conceptualizing sort of war as this larger event, sort of breaking up war into these smaller imagined moments of non-human animals becoming lost to war. And so throughout the text, I have these little poems that I kind of conceptualize as these spectral poetic moments, sort of engaging with these lost non-human lives, thinking about the time of their lost, their moments, their experiences.
I feel like a useful demonstration of this might be if you share one of the poems.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'll read a little poem called Raven's Coat. Last night I dreamt of a great feast. We shared stale flatbread, apples, discarded shawarma. We danced the debka, singing songs of Kitmir and Argos. Drifting to sleep, next to you, my world, the scent of figs, breathing your raven's coat.
And what's that poem about?
That poem was an imagination of these two dogs sleeping on the streets of Baghdad, their experience of war, and one of them waking up to sort of share their dream experience with another dog.
I see. And what's striking about that poem, and this speaks to a puzzle that I had about your use of poetry more broadly, it's about voices. So in that poem, you're speaking in the voice of a dog. And I remember you borrowing the Derridean idea of a ghostly conversation with the dead. So I was left wondering how much the poetry was meant to be in your voice and about animals, or how much it was your attempt to give a voice to animals.
It's a really good question. I think I do both sometimes. I think the idea of the voice is always a puzzle in the space of a poem. So oftentimes I'm imagining a non-human animal's voice and trying to sort of give that voice expression through my own voice. And in other poems, it's my own voice trying to engage in some kind of ghostly, haunting conversation with the non-human dead. So it's a bit of both.
That's striking. But it's particularly interesting given the voice of the animal that you are presenting or the voice that you're engaging with. This is an imagined animal, isn't it? Or it's not.
Correct.
Well, sometimes it's an imagined animal and sometimes it's literally an animal who you've seen a photo of, for example.
That is true. So there are a number of photographs that I have throughout the text that were taken often by Department of Defense photographers in Iraq. And so they've taken some photographs of, for example, stray dogs on the streets of Baghdad. And so oftentimes when I was writing a poem, I had these specific images in mind, these particular non-human animals. And so yes, I'm imagining these non-human animals and their experiences, but they're based in real experiences of some sort, experiences that we can kind of poetically tap into in the text.
And what do you think is the value of poetry specifically for remembering animals?
Yeah, I think poetry opens up a conversation with the reader. And so that poem I just read, I could have explained some more things about it, but I think the poem offers itself up to the reader to sort of engage in their own conversation with these non-human animals, to have their own kind of experience. So oftentimes in academic text, we are presenting arguments, we're trying to clarify certain things, presenting something novel, some new understanding of the world. And I think the poem offers something a little bit different. It sort of engages the reader in an imaginative state of mind for them to sort of enter into the conversation with the reader and have their own kind of experience while reading the text. So rather than just simply reading an academic text and considering its arguments, reading this text, I kind of wanted it to be an experience for the reader to sort of really sink into the experience of the non-human lost that they are reading about. So that to me, I think is the value of weaving poetry into this academic text.
Why do you think it's so important to remember? And the reason I ask this is that I can imagine people saying that a focus on remembrance can be too backwards looking when we should be trying to improve the world for current and future animals.
Another really good question. I think it's only by looking at or not only, but I think looking into the past and imagining the memory of lost animals that can certainly inform our future work and our future practices toward building a more just interspecies world community. And so I think we can never forget the past. And I think really remembering the past, really thinking about these experiences of non-human lives and their experience of war, whenever we are confronted in the future about the potential for violence, the potential of conflict and war, having the memory of these non-human lives can inform our thinking about these potential future decisions and hopefully give one pause when thinking about the possibility of using force and violence.
And what do you think is the scholarly benefit of including these poems? And the reason I ask that is because I've read a good bit of international relations scholarship, and it's unusual for poetry to be included. And it's especially unusual, I think, for the academic's own poetry to be included.
Yeah, I think that's another really good question. My own background is one as a poet and also a political scientist. So as a poet and a political scientist, I think it's probably easier to keep those two things separate. But if one reads, for example, the text of Derrida, one of the interesting things that he does, I think, is he sort of breaks apart some of these binary categories. Like, what is the academic text? What is a philosophical text? What is a poetic text? Where do we come up with these categories, and how do we sort of construct these rigid boundaries? And so I'm not saying that there are not these boundaries, but I think it can be a productive way to sort of blur these boundaries. I think sort of reading poetry alongside sort of more traditional academic arguments can sort of provide a different emotional intensity to those academic arguments. And I also think that the academic arguments read alongside the poetry can provide a sort of interesting sort of scholarly orientation to the poetry as well. And I think there's been a few recent attempts to sort of to bring poetry into the IR scholarly text. Roxanne Doty is one. I think she recently retired. I had a chance to do some poetry readings with her earlier this year. So there's been a few attempts, but yeah, traditionally, I think scholars will mine others' poetry and use other people's poetry to provide some kind of understanding about politics or global affairs. But scholars are frequently reticent to engage in their own poetic or creative practices. But I think doing so can be really helpful. I think it can be an interesting experience both for the author, but also a meaningful experience to the reader as well. And I think poetry can illuminate a lot about our world. I think oftentimes scholars don't like to sort of deal in ambiguity or uncertainty, whereas that's kind of the terrain of poetry, to think in terms of uncertainty and ambiguity and open interpretation. So I think bringing that into the academic text, there could be some productive value there.
Yes, I understand what you mean. And it does strike me when you talked about your earlier work, you talked about the poems as kind of marginalia. And they almost have that effect in this book, or that was my impression. It's not like you presented the poem and then analysed the poem. It's that the poems interspersed the academic work, or maybe academic work interspersed the poems, one or the other. And so they were very much side by side. It wasn't obvious that either of them took the lead, as it were.
Yeah, that is true. And I definitely did not want to provide any kind of analysis of my own poetry in the text itself. I wanted it to sort of kind of sit there. I kind of wanted the poem to be a bit of a disruption, a bit of a surprise to some extent, even though you understand that there's poetry in the book, but each time you encounter a poem, it's a bit of a disruption. And the poem can sort of disrupt your thinking about the experience of war. And I think in those moments in the text, you can shift into a different mindset and really start to think about the non-human experience of war.
Yes, that was certainly my experience as a reader. Let's talk a little bit more about the animals that you look at. So you focus on stray dogs, focus on caged zoo animals, both in Iraq, and then again in Iraq, but branching out a little bit to other conflicts as well. You talk about the animals impacted by environmental destruction in war. Can I ask why you chose to focus on those animals in particular, and whether there were perhaps other animals impacted by war that you considered including?
There were other animals also impacted by war. I think when I selected or when I focused on those particular kinds of animals, I think that there were many news stories about those non-human animals. So there was more information to work with. So there was a lot written about zoos in Iraq, for example. And so I could really focus on those news stories to inform what I was writing. Same thing with the stray dogs. The chapter that's on the rise of ISIS and the ecological effects of the rise of ISIS, that was a bit more challenging. For example, there were news stories that just briefly mentioned the killing of sheep, for example. So that chapter in particular was difficult to focus on in terms of there was just not a whole lot there other than some brief fragments of facts. There were other non-human animals too impacted by war, but I think I ultimately went with stray dogs and zoo animals because there was a lot there. And I also wanted to really make sure that I focused on the rise of ISIS because that's such an important part of the story of the Iraq War. And so looking into how non-human animals were impacted by the rise of ISIS, in particular in northern Iraq, was an important goal for this book project.
One group of animals that you didn't talk about are what we might call animal soldiers, or you didn't talk about them very much.
Right.
And do you think that there's a very different thing going on with them rather than these animals who are what we might call collateral damage?
It's a really good question. Yes, certainly in going to war, non-human animals are used by militaries. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, the US military and the British military as well uses dogs. They use dogs as a form of non-human labor to sniff out mines, to detect mines. Some of those dogs have been killed and seriously injured. I make brief mentions of them, but that's not so much my focus. There's not been a lot, but there's been a decent amount of focus on these military dogs. And I wanted to focus on the stray dogs or give much more emphasis to the stray dogs because they're sort of the, I guess, conceptualized as the less important ones. Soldier dogs are considered to be these kind of patriotic dogs. Soldier dogs are widely celebrated, at least in American culture. Stray dogs, not so much, right? These are the dogs that exist on the margins that aren't seen as having any value. They have no real use for the military. They're seen as problems. And so that's why I wanted to focus on those kinds of animals rather than the dogs that serve some kind of utility for the militaries.
Let me ask a big question that speaks to our shared interest in animals and warfare. How would you like to see scholarship on animals and warfare develop? And that might be in international relations or it might be in other disciplines as well. Do you think that there are questions that need to be asked that we're not asking? Do you think that there are perhaps questions that we're getting wrong collectively?
Okay, that's a very good question. I think one strand of scholarship that you are doing is just war scholarship, bringing non-human animals into questions about just war theory. I think that's a really important avenue of research. So I'm glad to see your work on that. When we think about international relations, almost every part of international relations can have a non-human component to it. And so, I mean, in that sense, there's countless avenues of research that we could pursue. For me, off the top of my head, I think exploring the global factory farm could be really important. I think most people's experiences with non-human life is the consumption of non-human life. And so the rise of the global factory farm as a sort of system, a global system, I think is one potential avenue of research that IR scholars or political scientists could take. Obviously, I have an interest in merging the aesthetic with the theoretical, so I think scholars could bring creative, poetic work into their study of non-human human-animal relations in international relations.
Now, Matthew, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes, I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
It's a difficult question. I think for me, it was scholars like Ellen Malloy and Barry Lopez. They're writers, they're not scholars in the traditional sense, but people like Ellen Malloy and Barry Lopez wrote about bighorn sheep and wolves, and their text really informed my own work and probably was the first, I guess you could say, pro-animal scholarship that I've read.
And can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, it was a paper called Cosmopolitanism in a Carnivorous World that was published in the journal Politics and Animals, and that was a focus on the consumption of non-human animals as a global justice issue.
And if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
It would be Jacques Derrida, probably the most influential scholar for me. I think every sentence I write, every thought I have about non-human animals is in some way influenced by Derrida. If I could also include one other scholar, Rafi Hewitt, a contemporary political scientist, his work is also quite influential on me as well.
And what's the most important thing you think academics can do for animals?
I think one important thing academics can do is do a better job of listening to other voices. For academics, most of what most of us do is teach and work with students. So in the classroom, whether in person or online, I think it's critical to do a better job of listening and being open to students' perspectives on non-human life and interspecies relations. I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. And I think it's our job to cultivate more productive forms of listening. Along those lines, I think one thing professors can do for animals in the classroom is be silent and listen. And in this silence, we can include spending time listening with students to the voices of non-humans, birds, for example, that are right outside of our physical or virtual classrooms. And I think this kind of listening can help us become more open to more innovative and just interspecies relations.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think one thing that could be important would be to continue reworking our conceptual framework for thinking and speaking about non-human animals. For instance, Derrida talks about non-human animals as having cultures, languages, consciousness, politics, desires, experiences of death and friendship, and having a perspective on humans. continuing to shift the conceptual terminology that underlies how we think, speak, and make political decisions could, I think, foster greater emotional and political solidarities that could move us toward a more just and inclusive world.
And what are you working on next?
What am I working on next? I have several projects that I'm currently working on. One is a hybrid poetry theory project on the future of the global factory farm. Another is a project that's kind of an interspecies autoethnopoetic analysis of a wildlife refuge. And then I have a couple other projects about non-human life and war.
And how can people find out more about your work?
One could Google my name and Google Scholar to find some of my academic work. My book was recently published in paperback form. You could go to the SUNY Press website and look for a copy there. I am on Twitter. I'm not too active on Twitter. I check my Twitter account maybe once a week, but if I publish something, I'll post it on Twitter, so people can check me out on Twitter.
Well, thanks, Matthew, for joining us for this podcast.
It was really great. Thanks for the opportunity, Josh.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook, and you can just find us at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast where you found it. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.